Thank you so much for coming to this panel about manifestations of anti-Semitism today. I'm Deepa Bharath with the Associated Press's Global Religion team. Before the AP, I was a reporter with the Orange County Register for 16 years, so I see a lot of familiar, friendly faces here. So during my time at the Register, I wrote quite a bit about hate and extremism, including anti-Semitism. For the next hour, we'll be hearing from our distinguished panel about the evolving nature of anti-Semitism. And I'm certain that their powerful stories and their experiences and their insights will help us all understand how to recognize anti-Semitism regardless of where it's coming from, because that is a critical step, as our speakers earlier said, in understanding how to counter hate and effect change. So it's now my honor to introduce our panelists today. Mark Rotenberg oversees Hillel's Campus Climate Initiative, working across US with Hillel professionals and higher education leaders to ensure a campus environment in which every student can feel comfortable learning about identifying with Judaism and Israel. Mark has spent most of his professional career on university campuses, serving for many years as general counsel at the University of Minnesota and at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome. Next, we have Oren Jacobson, who is co-founder of Project Shema, which helps Jewish students, leaders, and organizations navigate the difficult conversations surrounding the Israel-Palestine and anti-Semitism, and provides social justice-centered anti-Semitism education to public and private institutions. Through his work, he has advised global Jewish institutions and served as a subject matter expert on anti-Semitism to global corporations. Welcome, Oren. April Powers is Managing Director of First Impression RX, which helps companies manage differences through training, interculturalism, and diversity. She is the co-founder of Jubian Princess, I'll let her explain that, and DEI strategist for ProjectShema.org. April is committed to building inclusion in Jewish spaces and beyond. She sits on her synagogue board and on the advisory board of Progressive Zionists of California. Welcome, April. And last but not least, we have Chuck Leek, who was actively involved with white supremacist groups for over 15 years, beginning in the mid-1980s. But after learning that a girlfriend was half Jewish, he began to question those beliefs, which was the beginning of a long disengagement process for Chuck. In 2011, Chuck was introduced to Life After Hate, and with their support began speaking publicly against his former beliefs. Today, he works as an exit specialist with Life After Hate, providing peer mentoring services to people exiting hate groups. So
sometimes it feels like monitoring.
That's true. So in this morning's plenaries, we heard about what it means to be Jewish, the different forms Jewish identity takes. We've heard about how do we define anti-Semitism. We also heard about how anti-Semitic tropes and conspiracy theories can creep into progressive spaces. We also heard about the power of storytelling, which is kind of my area, but I also see how uncomfortable storytelling makes people, and how we have to kind of sit in each other's discomfort if we are to hear stories in a truthful and sincere manner. So I'm going to kind of start here with April Powers. Can you tell us what happened to you at the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, where you were the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer? And through that experience, why do you think that Jewish people are often excluded from DEI training?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for my introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I've actually done full trainings for the city of Orange County, so I'm happy to see some of you here. True to my Jewish values, as the ambassador said, I've lived my life in progressive spaces and working towards social justice and activism, and was the head of inclusion for companies like Nestle, did similar work at Amgen, and Jubian Princess is bringing that with my other Black Jewish partner. We bring Black Jewish experience and values into Jewish spaces, so and inclusion there. last year, when I was the Global Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer for a large nonprofit called Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, I started my year writing statements in support of Black lives after the George Floyd murder, and continued throughout the year with a statement in support of trans youth and their families, against anti-Asian hate. And when Jews were being beaten on the streets of New York, Paris, Los Angeles, and elsewhere for a war that was happening in Israel, when Hamas attacked Israel, basically, I started to put out a statement, and that statement had to go to the board. It needed approvals. It was a whole process. And one of the board members who quit over this particular incident said, well, we have to mention Israel. I said, we are absolutely not mentioning Israel in this statement where Jews are being beaten elsewhere, because Jew hate predates Israel in its modern form. And so we put out a statement. We had to All Lives Matter this statement, by the way, which left us open to what happened. We had to say this and all other forms of bigotry and some other things. And a woman who happened to be a new member, a Palestinian new member, who my mistake, I didn't vet her or look at anything else that she had done before, attacking other anti-Semitic statements, said, hey, I see this is for everyone. Does this include Palestinians and Muslims? And I said, absolutely. We want you here. In fact, I created new policies and procedures to make sure that Muslims in particular were taken care of at all of our events. And then she said, well, and the words twisted, well, where's the statement for Palestinians and Muslims? I don't see one. And it became sort of, she took over this statement and made it about another group, which, as my policy, I don't allow to happen. And then I said, well, hey, when we see a surge, we will absolutely post something. And then we got hashtag Free Palestine. The whole thing was taken over, talking about slaughtering children, etc. People came for me. I was called, as a Black Jew, this was surprising, I was called a white supremacist Talmudic Jew, see you next Tuesday, or CUNT. And I should die, and so should my mother. There were death threats. The FBI got involved. It basically shut me down for 9 months. Because not only did that happen, but I know that my progressive peers that I fought for and continue to fight for did not show up for me. And moreover, did they not show up for me, they bashed me and said that I was an oppressor because I blocked her for talking about slaughtering children on a children's book website, which I also did to any Jews who said that about Palestinians, for the record. So for me, I had to change my life. My kids got phones before they should have. My alarm system changed, like everything. It was a pretty awful experience. Why is it so important for me that DEI fold anti-Semitism into their programs? For precisely what Eric Ward was talking about. It fuels all the other bigotries. And if we don't understand the oldest systemic hate that we have on the planet that we know of, we can't really effectively combat the other ones. And I think I took up enough time. But if anybody has questions, I'm here all day.
Thank you. Thank you, April, for sharing your story. I think this is the point of this panel, is to hear these real stories, so you get concrete examples of how anti-Semitism manifests itself. On that note, I'm just going to move over to Oren Jacobson here. So how did anti-Israel expressions get swept up in American social justice movements? I know that's what you focus on, so I'm going to get straight to that. Yeah, very easy question.
So when Donald Trump was elected president, those of us who spent our life in progressive movements in particular were reasonably stunned. It's a fair statement. And one of the big questions that we were all asking ourselves was, how do you go from Barack Obama to Donald Trump? And so you're sort of looking for an explanation to make sense of the world, right? We're telling stories, as Eric said, to make sense of the world. And if you think about the progressive movement of 2012 with Obama in the White House, and really up until the moment that Donald Trump got elected, there was sort of an optimism of where this country was going, right? Lincoln freed the slaves, Martin Luther King and civil rights, and now we've got a black man in the White House, like we're on the ascendancy, right? And as a way to sort of explain this backlash and this response to the black man in the White House, a lot of the dialogue inside of our spaces began to center on these big systemic issues, social constructs, white supremacy, colonialism, patriarchy, and to another extent, capitalism as well. One of the things that's happened over history for Jews is that the greatest sins of society have always been placed onto Jews. So when the issue was the crucifixion of Jesus, the Jews were the Christ killers. In communist nations, Jews are the capitalists undermining the people. In capitalist nations, Jews are the communists undermining the people. In Nazi Germany, with their pseudo-race science, we were the impure race undermining the white race, the pure-blooded Aryan race. And so what's ended up happening over the last few years is that Israel has become sort of a poster child in these conversations for really the worst sins of the modern Western world, right? And so Israel becomes sort of a white supremacist, settler colonial, patriarchal society, and the way to understand Israel is to understand America. And so, there's plenty of easy snapshots of things happening in the world that make that story actually pretty easy to digest, especially if your critique of the world is what I just mentioned, sort of that framework of these systems of power and oppression. And like April, I spend all of my time doing progressive organizing work, not as well as Eric, I don't think, but decently well. Criminal justice reform, I help lead an organization focused on bringing more men into the fight to protect and expand reproductive rights in America. We operate in multiple states, and so most of my organizing work is actually not around anti-Semitism or Israel, it's around these causes. And so if you are critiquing our society in ways that I think are fair to explain the systemic inequities of our society, and then you look across an ocean, it's not that hard to see similar things. The challenge, though, is that the entire world isn't America, and the entire world isn't the Western world, and the cleavages in Israel, or the cleavages in the Middle East, or the cleavages in Asia are not the same exact cleavages across societies that exist here. But when you sort of overlap that lens onto the conversation and you start to look across at what you perceive as a white religious community oppressing a community, an indigenous community of color, it becomes really easy to say, if I understand this place, meaning America, I can understand Israel. And so that allows more space for ideas that have been out there for a long, long time to take root and become more normalized inside of the space. And has been said by others, right, when an idea isn't challenged, if I don't push back on an Islamophobic comment, if I don't push back on a sexist comment, it becomes normalized in the group that I'm in. And so that's part of what's happened. And I will say this, because most people don't know what it means to be a Jew, and because most people don't actually know what anti-Semitism is, and because most people don't know how anti-Semitism works, most people in these spaces that I'm in don't even notice or recognize when things actually are a problem, which isn't to say that criticism of policies of the Israeli government is a problem. It's to say that sometimes other things happen, but most of my peers don't notice it, which then allows it to become normalized and become more part of the discourse.
Thank you. Now, all of those tensions almost often boil over to the campus, to the college campus and high school campuses, and that's where Mark comes in here. Now, we know that the Israel-Palestine issue has caused significant tensions on college campuses, but it's kind of like a two-sided issue with anti-Semitism, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you have the BDS movement and everything that's associated with that, and then on the other hand, you have white nationalist groups, sending out their propaganda into college campuses through flyers and so on. So can you talk about these two different manifestations of anti-Semitism on campuses?
Thank you, Deepa. So I come to this work as a former chief legal officer of two very large research universities. And up until 3-4 years ago, I was not involved in the Jewish professional space. But as has been said several times here this morning, universities have become an epicenter for this problem. And so I decided to switch roles and become a unicorn, which is what the CEO of Hillel International called me. He wanted somebody who could translate into higher ed spaces what the Jewish community now perceives to be a very, very central priority. Hillel is operating on over 550 campuses across the world. We have 5 campuses in the Ukraine, which I didn't even know until 6 months ago. And this has become really, as I said, an epicenter of concern for the thousands of Hillel professionals that operate on, as I said, over 550 campuses around the world. The conflict on the left is something that I'll spend a minute on, but let me just reference first the attacks on Jewish students coming from the right. We've seen already and discussed already here this morning the stereotyping of Jews as money grubbers, as people who control the media, the economy of their country, and so forth, and the government. For most Jewish students, not all, for most Jewish students who are, after all, on their campus principally not to be spear throwers on anti-Semitism, right? They're there to get their engineering degree or their fine arts degree or to join clubs and sororities and fraternities and so on. These kinds of attacks strike many of our students as being crazy because they are so disembodied from their own young lives, most of them. And so when there's a swastika in the snow at Cornell, or when there's an outrageous incident at a public university dining hall or on social media from the right, many of these students simply dismiss that as being nuts, crazy, outrageous, and they are able to assimilate that into their lives and proceed. On the left, however, while it is by far less violent than the attacks from the right, there is a deeper wound and problem for many Jewish students on our campuses because overwhelmingly our community, as Rabbi Saperstein has noted and others, our community identifies with progressive movements in this country for many, many decades. And for Jewish students who overwhelmingly come from homes where progressive values are imbued in them, an attack by their roommate as being a white racist or a colonial imposter in an indigenous part of the world strikes them much more deeply. And the BDS movement, the boycott, divest, and sanction movement, affects our Jewish students in a much deeper way because it represents a conflict for them between their Jewish identities, and we have to make this a plural, right? As Rabbi Saperstein and others have already noted, Jews in this country are a very diverse group, and Jewish students are an even more diverse group. There are more Jewish students of color than there are Jews as a percentage in America as a whole. The younger people in our community are more diverse than the older people in our community. These conflicts and these attacks strike them in a much deeper way because let's remember something, folks. Internally to Jewish history, internally to Jewish culture, our liturgy, our holy texts, our songs, there is no identification of Jews as white. You will never find in the Talmud a discussion of Jewish whiteness, right? There are no Jewish poems and prayers and stories about Jewish whiteness. Identifying a 19-year-old engineering student as a white Jew may be appropriate in the context of America today, but it has no indigenous, and I use that term very deliberately, it has no indigenous meaning in Jewish history. Right? And we don't need to talk about all the different ways in which Jews were identified as not white, as Oren mentioned a minute ago. So that's a very brief headline description of what many Jewish, not all, and not on all campuses, but what many Jewish students are facing from the right and from the left.
Well, thank you so much. And Chuck, I have to tell you, one of the least favorite of my assignments as someone covering hate and extremism was to go to a white supremacist website and look up their propaganda about Jewish people. Now, you were ingrained in those movements for a while. What are some of your thoughts on how you actually got drawn into that propaganda and how you got out of it?
It's kind of a long and involved story, but so to sum it up, generally what I'd say is that it was trauma that got me involved in the movement, and it was trauma that pulled me out. It doesn't, I mean, I'm not trying to like excuse the choices I made and trying to pass it off as, you know, an effect of something that happened to me, but the things that happened to me in childhood kind of set the stage that allowed me to, you know, adopt things that I absolutely disagree with now. And also part of that was there was a pretty deep culture in the time that I was growing up in the, you know, I grew up in LA, I was born and raised in LA, I have deep ties to Orange County. My grandparents lived here until they died. I spent summers here every year growing up. And in LA and Orange County in the 70s and 80s when I grew up, there was a really deep undercurrent of white supremacy. It was prevalent everywhere in the schools I went to. You know, kids would draw swastikas or SS bolts or SWP on their folders. And it was desensitizing. You get desensitized to the symbology. And so, you know, I was dealing with, you know, traumatic issues that, or I'm not dealing with them actually, but things that caused a deep well of self-hatred that I then, you know, as I moved into my late teens and early adulthood, kind of unleashed on the world because I didn't understand where I was inside myself. And then, so I was looking for easy answers to like the real, like, deep struggles I had within myself that I couldn't cope with, didn't understand, couldn't like comprehend. And to, you know, I joined the military and then I got connected with skinheads and like started getting direct propaganda through music and through, you know, stuff that we were sharing amongst each other in the way of zines and things like that. And so the early desensitization and the trauma, and then to find a group of people that had, like, as their stated goal, like, you know, brotherhood and love for their race and so forth and so on, and all the nonsense they spout, it gave me like a sense of purpose and like belonging, and which was something I really didn't have at the time. And then, you know, so there's like a deep undercurrent of anti-Semitism in this movement, and it makes a real easy target to point all of these issues that I had that I didn't know how to deal with at an external group, and make that external group like the reason for the problems that I had, you know, like whatever the you know, trouble I got into, you know, with law enforcement, you know, like economic problems I had, all of those things were easy to blame on the Jews because they controlled everything. You know, they were this overarching force that was trying to, like, you know, destroy my life personally. And then that whole, like, so a lot of people don't understand about, like, the white supremacist movement in the United States. They look at it as deeply anti-black, which it is, but I mean, from my personal experience of it, the real underpinning of it is anti-Semitism, and that they use anti-Semitism as the point that everything else revolves around, as far as like how white people are being, disenfranchised, and where the integration is coming from, where, immigration is coming from, and the point of that being, the destruction of European people. All of that hinges and circulates around anti-Semitism as the main point that gives entry to all the rest of it, I guess. And so when I was involved, from the KKK people to the outright neo-Nazis, anti-Semitism was really the linchpin to everything. Anyway, so
Thank
I
you.
hope that answered the question.
Yes, you did. Thank you. April, it's really complicated being African American, being a black Jewish woman at that, and leading a DEI program the way you do. I'm sure that is wrought with a lot of challenges for you personally and professionally. But can you talk about why Jewish people are often excluded from DEI training, and what are some of the consequences of such exclusion?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that question. Yeah, it's fun being me, let me tell you. I can be discriminated in like 15 different ways, just you watch. And on top of it, my nieces and nephews are LGBTQ+, Jutinos. We've got the whole basket, and some neuroatypicality mixed in. So repeat the beginning of the question. I've got the end of the question.
Oh, of course. Why do you think Jewish people are excluded from DEI
Thank you.
training?
Jewish people are excluded because when you think Jew, you do not think of somebody who looks like me. In our minds, in the United States of America, we consider Jews to be a white religious community. And I do a lot of work with Project Shema and Oren, who has a great framework for this. And if you go to his session, you'll learn more later. But if you think of Jews as a white religious privileged community, which is unique in our thousands of years of history, we have never had it this good, right? Like, this is not the norm. It is an exception to the rule, and it doesn't mean, as was mentioned, we still have the same poverty levels, similar socioeconomic disparities as the general population, and the fact that we even have that, we think of that as amazing, okay? Because civil rights for Jews is a very modern phenomenon, like only maybe a couple hundred years old. So the Jews are left out because of that perception. We don't realize that there are a lot of Jews that look like me in the U.S., and outside the U.S., more than 50% of the population we would consider Jews of color or multi-ethnic Jews or Jews of other, based on our own definitions. So there's no sense of urgency, right? They're white, they're privileged, why are we dealing with this? And when you go to the framework of, no, in fact, we've never been considered white, and if you're a Jew who considers yourself white, I invite you to check the other box, starting as soon as you're comfortable doing so that we get counted properly. At the end of the day, is the KKK and the neo-Nazis, once they take over, are we gonna be put in the white box?
Yeah, I think it was Dr. Ward said something earlier about, if you think they're not coming for you, you're wrong. No, you don't get to check the white box.
You don't get to use a sword and a shield, right?
Yeah, right.
You don't get to be white and stay safe here, and then later on have it be used against you. So no, we are not, and we're not considered white by a number of groups, and anti-Semitism is on the rise. I was one of thousands of incidents last year, and the highest year of anti-Semitism since it's been recorded since the 70s, right? So we know that it fuels other hate. We know, I won't repeat what everyone else has said. So if we can understand how the tropes, just the conspiracy theories fuel other types of hate and bigotry, then that helps combat other types of hate at the same time. I don't think we need to have anti-Semitism be the be-all and end-all in a DEI program, but I think we should fold it into the toolkit, certainly. And if you want to hear that talk, why you should fold it into your toolkit, if you go on my LinkedIn, you'll see a link to register for tomorrow's talk if you haven't had enough. Tomorrow's talk at 1:30, it's free, and you can see why it should be folded in to the toolkit. Additionally, I want to say one other thing. For K through 12 schools, just like we're trying to get Black boy joy and Black girl joy into the books and normalize some of these books, please include Jewish girl and Jewish boy and Jewish person joy, because if we are tokenized and everything is about us being a sad story and only Anne Frank, which please keep including that, we don't want the Holocaust denial, but Jewish children and all kids who are marginalized or othered need to see themselves having a normal life in books. So that's my, as someone who worked in that industry.
Oren, help us understand this phrase, Zionism is racism. What does it mean to those who say it in progressive and social justice circles?
So before I answer that, I just want to add one more thing to what April said,
Of course.
which is, as the ambassador spoke, right, about the complexity and nuance of Jewish identity, if you exclude anti-Semitism education from your DEI work, you're going to end up pushing forward a misunderstanding of Jewish identity. And if you end up pushing forward a misunderstanding of Jewish identity, you're also going to end up pushing forward a misunderstanding of anti-Semitism, which means that most people won't actually see the anti-Semitism when it's in front of them, which means you can't stop anti-Semitism. So I just want to underscore that with what April said.
I'm going to add one more thing too. If you are running a DEI program and you only have Jews as a religious community or group, then I invite you to also change that and make them an ethnic ERG, because that is where most of us sit. Most of us don't always see ourselves in Judaism. There are Jubus, Buddhist Jews, and atheists and everything.
Yeah.
So they should be on the religious council or the interfaith councils, but not always just seated in the religious group. Thank you.
Yes. So to Zionism is racism. Can't really answer that question without trying in some short way to define Zionism. And let me say that there are many Zionisms, right? Just as there are many forms of Jewish identity, there are many thoughts and schools of thoughts on Zionism. But for the average Jewish person, when we hear the word Zionism, what we think about is a movement for Jewish liberation and national self-determination in some portion of our ancestral homeland. Now, that being said, many Jews don't actually have a definition themselves of what Zionism is, but when we hear that word, that's usually what it means to the vast majority of Jews across the world. The idea that the Jews have a right to and a need for a state in some portion of our ancestral homeland. For Palestinians, the impact of Zionism is obviously very different, right? We've probably all heard of the term the Nakba. And if you think about what Jews would call the War of Independence, the flip side of that coin is the Nakba, right? An act of displacement. And so for Palestinians, the impact of the success of Zionism, the establishment of a Jewish state on a portion of our ancestral homeland, obviously is experienced very, very differently. When you're thinking about the framing or the word Zionism as racism, right? The power in those three words together is that it actually tells a story. And in that story, essentially, the only reason that a Jewish person, in particular, could support the existence or continuation of a Jewish state, this Jewish state, is because that person is inherently racist. Right? Zionism is racism, Zionists are racists. That the only reason that you could arrive at the conclusion that the Jewish people have a right to a state, and a state in this place, and the continuation of that state is that you're racist. Meaning that if I say Israel has the right to exist, I'm essentially in some ways complicit in the harm that the Israeli government may be inflicting onto the Palestinian people with whatever policy we want to criticize. The challenge with that, or the problem with that, is that it's a very dehumanizing framework, right? Inherently, we don't want racists around us, right? The racists aren't okay in our clubs. The white supremacists and the KKK need to stay at the fringes of our society. So what you're essentially saying when you say Zionism is racism or Zionists are racist, let me take this back. What we hear, because I think a lot of people actually use that framework without exactly knowing what Zionism is or what they're explicitly saying. But what Jews hear is that the 80 or 90% of us who believe in the legitimacy and need for a Jewish state on some portion of our homeland are irredeemable. That we are akin to white supremacists, KKK, neo-Nazis, white nationalists. So for us, that obviously strikes a whole bunch of fear because you're basically saying almost all of us are bad people. That's like the simple framework that we interpret that language as. And again, I never ascribe intent to who is using a framework. I have no idea what's in someone's heart or mind. And like I said, when people ask me if I'm a Zionist, my question back to them is, well, what is a Zionist? Because in most cases, they don't actually know what a Zionist is or what an anti-Zionist is, so you have to spend some time, to Eric's point, exploring what is our interpretation of one single word, and let's be honest, no one word can describe any one person, right? So the story then is that Jews are racist, or the reason that Jews continue to support quote-unquote Israel, which implies that we oppose the Palestinian people or a Palestinian movement for statehood, is that we're racist. And that's dehumanizing, and that creates fear because we've been dehumanized a whole bunch in our past, and that almost has never led anywhere good for us, right? There's a different story that I think needs to be understood, not as a way of challenging the narrative and concerns and the lived realities of the Palestinian people, but better understanding us. The ambassador talked about the almost 4,000-year connection for Jews to this land. And the 3,200 years, I think was your exact number, I was paying attention, to the continuous presence of Jews in this land. And so some people think about the word indigeneity and they think, where are you from? Other people hear indigeneity and they think, how long have you been there? And so from the framework of where are you from, the archaeological record is pretty straightforward on where Jews emanate from. And since Jews were forcibly removed from this land, violently removed and sent into diaspora in what we would call today an act of colonization, Jews have had at the center of our culture the idea of returning to Jerusalem, to Zion. So if you want to know where Zionism comes from, it's Zion is another word for Jerusalem. So while Zionism as a movement for a nation state, in a world full of nation states, emerges in the 19th century, it has been part of our cultural DNA for 2,000 years since we were forcibly removed and sent into diaspora. And then think about what happened to Jews when we were in diaspora. We all know about the Holocaust. It's a very famous story, what happened to us in Europe when we presented as white. There is a very large Persian community here in California. And if you've never had a chance to talk to a Jew from Iran about their experiences being a brown-presenting Persian Jew from Iran, you should. If you've never talked to an Ethiopian Jew, or an Iraqi Jew, or a Yemeni Jew, or a Syrian Jew, you should. An Egyptian Jew. What's that?
Leek from...
Yeah. And the reality is that while the life for the Jewish people in Europe was distinctly different in terms of the mass discrimination and violence than in any other part of the world, where Jews presented as black in North Africa, Jews were systemically discriminated against and faced violence for being Jews, forcibly driven out of the land. Where Jews presented as brown or longstanding parts of the population in Southeast Asia and Middle East, we were just Jews, and we were discriminated against for being Jews, and where Jews were presented as white in Europe, we were discriminated against and violently targeted for being Jews. So imagine now, in the aftermath of the Holocaust and that long story of attacks for centuries and centuries and centuries, after 2 in every 3 members of the Jewish people on a continent were murdered, and alongside it, societies in the Middle East, where there was almost 1 million of us spread out, said, we don't want you here either. Everybody then floods to this new state. And in the aftermath of that new state, a war breaks out, and then another war. And then when it becomes clear that you're not going to beat Israel on the battlefield, the tactics change, and they turn to acts of terror. And now you've got forces that have nothing to do with the Palestinian people, like Hezbollah or Iran, chanting death to Jews. And for 74 years, those people have lived in that little plot of land that's the size of New Jersey, surrounded by people who have not been too terribly happy, for some reasons understandable and for others deeply problematic, that the state exists and you lived under a constant state of violence. Now, if that's your story, if that's who you are, I would potentially say that your connection to the land is both deep and historically part of your cultural DNA. And I would say that wanting and believing and thinking that Jews need a state is a natural response to intergenerational trauma and fear. And as we sit here in this country watching democracy under attack, and conspiracies spread, and white nationalism come out from underneath the hood, and we hear folks on the right saying things like Jews will not replace us. And by the way, if you go onto right-wing blogs, you're going to find lots of attacks on Zionists in those spaces too. And then at the same time, you see this rising rhetoric around you saying that you're a racist just because you think Israel has the right to exist, even if I oppose every policy of the Israeli government. You would be afraid, or at least you'd be concerned. And so I think it's important to hear the stories of the Palestinian people and hold them in one hand. There are some people, though, who are saying to you, you should not listen to the stories of Jews. And what I am suggesting to you is that the truly just, progressive approach to this is to try to hold both of those stories together at once and not allow anybody to dehumanize either the Palestinian people or the Jews.
Thank you. Now, both of you, April and Oren, you spoke about the Jewish identity and how it cannot be just reduced to a faith. And, you got to look at the broader cultural, ethnic, historical identity, as you just eloquently mentioned. Mark, how has that identity not been recognized on college campuses? And how has that changed the climate on campus over the last decade or so?
So, as both April and Oren have said, the nature of Jewish identity, and especially for young people, has a diverse quality to it that is very frequently, not always, but very frequently not recognized by higher education administrators or structures. And that includes, especially as April was referencing, the DEI programs that proliferate by the thousands across American higher education today. Oren described in a very beautiful and eloquent way, in a little 5-minute encapsulation, how many Jewish people understand their history of marginalization and expulsions across hundreds of locations around the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe, and in the Americas. But as I mentioned before, for most young people attending college, they're there to get an education. They're there for socialization. They're there for professional growth and to find the qualifications that will get them a job. And in those spaces where our Jewish students want to belong, and that includes, as I referenced before, in socially progressive and social justice groups, the epithet of Zionism, that you're a Zionist, as Oren was saying, is hurled around at these young people as the kind of epithet that Oren mentioned, right? And it's actually much simpler than the story that Oren referenced. It's simply an epithet. It's like calling these young people kikes or other highly derogatory terms that were popular in ages past. The vast majority, and I say this as someone who's lived in a higher education space and worked professionally since I was 18 and went to college. I never actually left. I've been in the C-suites of big universities for a very long time. Most of these people don't know what they mean when they call a kid a Zionist. And most of these people, young people who say, you can't march in a protest against gender violence, against sexual assault for women or other gendered identified individuals if you're not willing to condemn Zionism. For most of the people who make that claim, they have no idea. They've never listened to Oren, or anyone else for that matter, talk about how the word Zionism is internalized within the Jewish community and how it's been virtually completely appropriated by people who are hostile to that idea. And so a 20-year-old or a 22-year-old who's just there to get an education and to feel part of a community of students and scholars, many of them wishing to be part of a progressive group, to be called a Zionist is simply to be insulted without reference to the story that Oren referenced. And this lands in particular, as I mentioned before, in an environment in which diverse identities is the name of the game, right? Very few Jewish students identify only and exclusively as Jews. They have a gender identity. They have a geographic identity. My wife are Cuban Jews, and her family are from Cuba, right? There's a geographic component often to their identities. There's an ethnic and racial and religious and cultural identity, and so to reduce them to being a Zionist and therefore a racist, right, is a gross distortion. And our higher ed institutions need to own that issue. Just as black folks didn't go to Ole Miss simply because 18 and 19-year-old black students decided to go there, just as women on college campuses who were subjected routinely to sexual violence and assault didn't suddenly solve that problem on their own, the administrations of our universities, I say this because we're in this venue, right? And there are going to be some 50 people who are going to be in our breakout, I hope, to talk about this in greater detail. Our institutions need to accept responsibility for this kind of marginalization and bullying and exclusion.
Thank you. I believe we've run right out of time, but I'm just going to quickly ask Chuck for a question about how, what were some of the things that helped you change your mind about anti-Semitism? I'm sure compassion was a big part of that, but if you could just address that really quick.
Sure, yeah. So yeah, compassion is something that pretty universally is recognized across all of the people that call us formers, call us whatever you want. But almost universally, the story hinges around somebody who was categorized as the other, who showed the person compassion. In my case in particular, I was going through a bunch of rough stuff and had stepped away from the groups that I was involved with, but still hadn't changed my mind. And I was dating a girl for about a year, and she was sitting there in a conversation with me one day, and we were like, I don't know, it was tense, but not an argument. And she said, well, I'm half Jewish, knowing full well that I was a, neo-Nazi skinhead, basically. And I sat there for, at least a minute, kind of shocked and stunned, and had this realization that I cared more about this person, loved her more than I cared about all of the things I had been espousing for, nearly 20 years at the point that this happened. So yeah, compassion, kindness, if you can show somebody who is involved in this stuff that on a personal level, it may be the thing that changed their mind, It's nice to end on that positive note, isn't it? Well, thank you very much, all our panelists, for your deep insights. We all learned a lot. Thank you so much.